Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and today it is time to do my Week 7 power rankings for the 2024 United Football League season. Now this past week we finally saw a legit upset, meaning that we actually have some movement in that middle area of the power rankings for the first time in quite a while. But again, this is one of those weeks that some people are overreacting, some are underreacting. I'm just kind of reacting based on what I've seen. We're now to a point where we pretty much know what these teams are. We know whether or not a guy had a bad game, a guy played really well. So we know if some games may be aberrations for one reason or another. And overall, this is a pretty tough one to make, as you can very well make a case that basically anywhere from the 3 to the 5 spot can be swapped up, and anywhere from the 6 to the 8 spot can be swapped up. Now, while the top two teams are pretty obvious in terms of who they are, even some people can test those ones. So this is definitely one of the first weeks in a while where you have power rankings that you can really make a case for almost anything. So without further ado, let's get right on into it with number 8, the Memphis Showboats. Yeah, the Showboats coming at last again. Look, I know some people have the Arlington Renegades at 8 because they're winless, and I do totally understand that, and I'll buy that argument. But the fact is the Showboats just are so bad. I mean, look, I put them at 8 last week because their last 3 losses had all been these blowout losses, and they just added to it with a 4th one. Back-to-back home games where their crowd just isn't showing up, because why would you go show up to a team that's just going to get beat? Look, the final score was 39-21, and the only reason it was that close was because the Stallions allowed the Showboats to get 12 points in the 4th quarter. The Showboats allowed 466 total yards. Adrian Martinez put in one of, if not the best QB performance of the season this year on them. They just played terribly. I mean, 2 different fumbles that they lost. They didn't really play good passing. They once again were putting in 2 different QBs in Cookus and T-Will, and it wasn't working either of them. Their defense has now become the worst in the league, worst in points and worst in yards. So there's no saving grace there. Now, while their rushing game is still technically better than what it was at the beginning of the year, it's still terrible. But like I said, I mean, it's just hard to put this team anywhere above 8. When you have no saving grace as a team, there's nothing I can really look at aside from, I guess, kicking that's good. I really can't argue putting this team above anyone else. This team doesn't keep games close. Their one win was against a Jarrett Garantano-led Houston Roughnecks, in which they barely scraped out a win there. Then they blew a game against a team that had over 150 penalty yards, and since then, they've just been getting blown out game after game after game after game. Now, this next week is the real test, because we have UFL Tank Bowl 2 between the Showboats and Renegades, which I will be live streaming that game, by the way. That game, if they lose that one, yikes. But at this moment, they're still number 8 in my books. They're just pretty bad. And the worst part is their most impactful injuries really haven't been that bad. Look, this team has cut a few guys for different reasons, but in terms of true injuries, this team really hasn't dealt with many. At least from what I can see, it's not like they really have anyone on IR. It's just a bunch of guys that, have minor injuries, right? DeAndre Overton was suffering from a shoulder injury this past week. Some other guys did end up playing but have been limited, like a Wes Saxon. I know Darius Victor has been banged up. But in terms of a true massive injury, this team really hasn't had that many. So the fact that they're as bad as they are this season is a testament to just how bad everything is going. Whether it be the, coaching to the players, to just guys gelling, to guys underperforming from last year. It's just been a bunch of disappointments. This team has been the biggest disappointment of the season. Because at least with the Renegades, you can say a lot of it last season was that magic carpet ride that Luis Perez took them on, to where he was carrying them to just something that the team shouldn't be able to do. And with the Showboats, they were supposed to be great. They've been terrible. Worst team in the league. Don't even really have any real impactful injuries. I know Vontae Diggs being banged up hurts, but nothing really major. Team is bad. They're number 8. Now, number 7 is going to be the Houston Roughnecks. This might be a shock to people. I said it before and I'll say it again. So far this season, Luis Perez, you can make a very good case. I'm not saying I agree with it, but you can make an argument he has been the best quarterback in the league when you account for what his weapons are compared to like an Adrian Martinez and an A.J. McCarron, who both have receiving cores that, well, the Stallions maybe, but the Battlehawks do have a better receiving core. And you consider what Perez has had to deal with the offensive line and all that. He's been, at best, the best quarterback in the league, and at worst, the 3rd best quarterback in the league. That's basically the argument. Is he 1st, 2nd, or 3rd in the league? He had one bad game. They lost to the Roughnecks in that game. That was his off game, and that's why a lot of people wouldn't put him at the number 1 or number 2 spot, because of that game against the Roughnecks. If he played the way he did against any other team this season, like he did the Roughnecks, the Renegades probably win that game by 2 scores. So it took that And since then, the Renegades put on another couple close games, whereas the Roughnecks have gotten blown out. Roughnecks aren't good. Look, I know they kept this game closer. I predicted they would, and they technically would have covered if it wasn't for the intentional safety. But the fact is that the Roughnecks really weren't in this game the same way. They had chances to win, but their poor coaching, their poor offensive talent got proven. And it's not even that their talent's bad. They have great receivers. It's just that Mark Thompson, whether he's retiring or just was doing trolling from what it looked like on X, TJ Pledger is still being hit or miss. And their QB play, even though Sinet is better than Garantano, it's not like he's been lighting up the world the past couple weeks. This team just isn't good. They're tied with the Showboats for the worst turnover differential in the league. They're second to worst in overall yards per game, with only the Showboats being worse. And against the Battlehawks, the defense did its job, but it wasn't enough. The fact is, this team just doesn't give me any confidence. At least with the Renegades, I can say, yes, they lost that game because Perez was, not playing good. And even then, if it wasn't for that penalty and that final drive, the Renegades probably go on to win that game. Whereas the Roughnecks, it's just, what have they done? If their defense isn't playing over the top, they're not really competitive. This team just doesn't look good. They still have yet to put up 20 points. Remember, this is a team that their head coach says is the best offense in the league. They still can't put up 20 points. This team is, to me, the second worst in the league. I know some people put the Renegades below them, and I understand if you do. I think the Roughnecks are the second to worst team in the league. Now, in regards to injuries, this team has had its fair share of injuries. That defensive line was supposed to be an unbelievable unit, and it's taken a few hits. Carlo Kemp retiring early on in the season was a big one. Then you also had Olive Sagapalu getting put on the IR a couple weeks ago. That was a massive blow as well. And then Reggie Walker, another guy. And yes, Kirk Merritt's injury wasn't the worst thing because Thompson's back, but now you could very well argue that maybe you'd rather have Merritt because Thompson really hasn't been insane. He's had a couple breakthrough runs every week, but in terms of overall play, he's not the same as he was last year. And then Woody Brandom just got put on the IR as well. So this team's had a lot of injuries. Their D-line took 3 massive hits. And while, yes, other guys like Ethan Westbrooks is playing really well, and you still have other guys playing great, Chris Odom among Keontae Schott and others, when you look at it, Mark Thompson's injuries didn't help. Who's to say that if he was actually healthy heading into the season, he's not the best running back in the league? Instead, he's played 3 games, averaging just 30 yards a game, only has 26 carries across 3 games, and while he has had a couple big runs and shows that he still has that elite talent in him, he's not doing it the same way he was last year, where it was almost every run he was going off. It's now every couple of runs. So because of that, I think that the injuries have been a big deal, and they kind of help put this team at 7. Number 6 is the Arlington Renegades. Look, Luis Perez is a top 3 quarterback in the league. People who say otherwise only look at the win-loss column. His stats are incredible. When they're losing games, it's really not because of him. The Roughnecks is the only one you could say he really kind of threw, quote-unquote, but every other game he's done his job. 1,300 yards passing, that leads the entire league. This team is winning at third down percentage. They're 48.7. Another main reason, Luis Perez. Now, their punt net average is also technically the best in the league, so in one of those, big stats, they're also winning in that one as well. But what are some of the issues? Against the Panthers, the team just lost in the end. Look, the Renegades got a bunch of bad penalties, and while there were a couple for the Panthers as well, the final play really showed how bad the Renegades were being kind of undisciplined. They got called for too many men on the field. Jake Bates would have missed the kick, and the Panthers would have lost. Except, even if that didn't get called, they still would have gotten a penalty for roughing the kicker because one of their rushers ended up basically tackled Bates. So even if they still had only 11 men on the field, they still would have been penalized. That play basically summed up their season. They're always in it, but they always find a way to lose. Jake Bates put the nail in the coffin, and this team is on life support. They need San Antonio to lose out, DC to lose every game except one of the 2 against USFL teams, and Renegades win out to make the playoffs. So they're still in it, but they're going to be eliminated probably next week. But we'll see. Maybe they get the win, maybe not. Again, it's just Luis Perez is great. The defense has technically been getting better-ish. They allowed less yards than they had before. They're moving up in the world. They're not the worst in points allowed anymore. They're not the worst in yards per game. They're still terrible, but like we saw with Henri St. Amour, him, having a full game under him, he looked really solid this past week. So overall, Putting the Renegades at 6. They've kept every game close. Their biggest loss was like 10 points. They're able to keep games close. They have a really solid QB. They have great receivers. It's just that they also had a lot of issues with the running back this past week. It's just that they can't finish games in the end, but I'm still putting them at 6. They've had a few injuries. Look, Garrett McGinn before the season was a big one. That was a dude that, if he was here this season, this team's a lot better. Garrett McGinn is one of the best tackles in the league. And then while Cam Brown and Tuzar Skipper both hurt, the running backs will see a lot of issues. Day Hunter and Devion Smith were the two that dressed this past week, and both of them got banged up this game. And so there's a lot of questions on exactly how healthy the two of them are. For their sakes, I hope they're good, and for the Renegades' sake. But if they're both hurt, yikes, that's really bad. But yes, the Garrett McGinn injury was the biggest one. Him missing the season really hurt. That's a guy that one guy on the offensive line can be a big deal. That's the kind of guy that would make it a big deal. He's there. This team probably has at least 2 wins. So, impactful injuries. The biggest one is McGinn, but the running backs are now a question as well. Number 5 is the DC Defenders. I'm not moving them up. Why, you may ask? Well, I said this during the week heading into the Battlehawks game last week, and I'll say again now. Their home field advantage, yes. Even though they announced attendance was 14K, we all agree it was not 14K there. But even then, their home crowd is still one of the best in the league. Their home field advantage is still very much a real thing. They, above every other team, even the Battlehawks, have the biggest home field advantage. You know why? Because if your team is now 11-1 at home, yeah, you've got a pretty damn good home field advantage. The Battlehawks are a close second in terms of win-loss ratio when you compare it, granted the Stallions, just always win, but you know what I mean. The Defenders, Audi Field home field advantage is crazy. They only won by 6, and it's not like they really, dominated. They didn't. I mean, stat-wise, it was pretty similar. Yes, they got completely outrushed by, 85 yards, but they completely outpassed the Brahmas. Third downs, they were terrible again. But, they were decently efficient in the red zone. They had 1 fumble but didn't lose it. They had no turnovers, and that's why they won the game. But the fact is, a lot of stats are still terrible. They're literally tied for the worst in third down percentage at 24-72 for 33.3%. They're the third to worst team in points allowed, and they're bottom 3 in yards allowed, and they're bottom 3 in yards per game on offense. This team does not deserve to move up after this one win. If they win this next week, then probably get moved up to 3. I'm not even joking. They probably move up to 3. But to get 1 win at home against a team that, is playing a quarterback that a lot of people are starting to come around to as not that guy, solid backup, but ain't going to win you a championship kind of guy. And even then, they barely eked out that win. There was another bad coaching decision, that awful timeout at the end of the game that Reggie Barlow called for no real reason, which, thanks to the horrid play call we'll get to in a second with the Brahmas, ended up not mattering. But still, the Defenders deserve to stay at 5. I'm not going to move them up because they barely won at home when they have this massive home field advantage, and you barely got the win. Putting them at 5, but if you win this next week, then you're going to move up a couple spots. Now, they've had a few impactful injuries, but a lot of them were mainly the beginning of the year before the season with Abram Smith. Look, people are realizing that Abram Smith was really the one that made this engine work. Now, granted, it's more of I like to think about it as trifecta, right? You had Lucky Jackson, you had Abram Smith, you had Jordan Ta'amu. Now the team is just Jordan Ta'amu. There's only so much they can do. Losing Briley Moore hurt. Losing Sean Bayer hurt. You lost 2 different tight ends. You've lost a couple DBs. Now, granted, Jajon Neal was for suspension, but still, Joseph Wallace, one of your DTs, got hurt. And now, while Trent Harris was a full go the last day of practice, he still is a bit banged up, and that's one of your best players. And then you had a couple other injuries as well to Bernard and Conley. But overall, the biggest one was the Abram Smith injury before the season. That and the 2 tight ends being hurt really hurt. Tight ends, great blockers, and you're missing them. You're going to get hit with a pass rush. It hasn't been good for the Defenders. Losing Smith really hurt because to this point, I still have really no faith in their other running backs being able to carry them to a playoff berth. While they're still technically very much alive thanks to beating the Brahmas, do I really see this team as a championship contender? No, and the reason is because I just don't think their running backs are good enough. That's the biggest reason for it. Defenders at 5. Coming in at number 4 is the San Antonio Brahmas. I've seen some people overreact to the point where they put him at 5, move him 2 spots down. I'm only moving him 1 spot down. You should have won this game. Even though, yes, you had 2 turnovers, you should have won. You decided to punt with like 2 minutes left. You got the ball back, and then you decided to do one of the dumbest play calls I've ever seen. When I heard hook and ladder, I was like, okay, I actually like this call. Do like the Vikings hook and ladder with Randy Moss, if you know, you know. No, what they wanted to do was this hook and ladder play, which used the 2 forward pass rule in the league to try and get the defenders off guard. The only thing that they didn't realize is if your offense hasn't been able to do anything the entire day, and you've, been sacked a couple times, you've been hit with 6 TFLs, you're probably not going to have enough time to actually do that whole play. And guess what happened? They didn't have enough time to do that whole play, and they lost. Quentin Dormady looked bad. Like, yes, he had a good completion percentage. He was 62. But, look, I was upset when AJ was averaging just under 10 yards a pass. Dude, Dormady, 16 completions for under 80 yards. Really? That's a really bad stat line. That is abysmal. That is just under 5 yards per completion. Think about that for a second. 16 completions for 79 yards. That's awful. He threw an interception as well. Now, yes, this team was saved by John Lovett having this absurd performance. He's now the leading rusher in the UFL. He had 153 yards on the ground on 23 carries. A really great game. He doesn't have this game. This team probably gets blown out. Now, blown out is like 18-6 in this case, but still. The Brahmas are still a solid offensive team and defensive team. They're third in points allowed. They're third in yards per game. And they're still technically kind of keeping up with it. Technically, their total yards was 267, which is less than what they normally have. But they did only allow 18 points. It's just, though, like I said, right? This team with Dormady at the QB, it's like I said back when they played the Panthers that first week. I said he played this incredible first half, but the second half he didn't look as good. And I heard multiple reasons. It's not just from one or two people who are Brahmas fans talk about it. I've heard multiple people, whether it be on X, on YouTube comments, say different reasons for it. I said then, and I'll say it again now. You cannot judge a quarterback on how good they are based on one game. When you come into play, you should dominate the opposing team. You should. But you don't have film on you with a specific team. You may have film on you from last season with a different team. You have no real film on you with this particular team in the Brahmas. So the opposing team does not really know what to do. Guess what happened? After the first half and the Panthers knew better about Dormady, they were able to stop him. It wasn't just they're going to run the ball. No, it was that Dormady wasn't able to complete passes. Then last week, while he had 3 interceptions on the stat sheet, I said it then and I'll say it now, only one of them was really on him. One of them was on coaching, one was on the receiver. But even if you take away those 2 interceptions out of the 3, he still played bad last week. And then this week, he had another game where he's not playing that good. There is genuine concern on this team's quarterback front. I would not be shocked if he gets benched this upcoming week. And I think that might be what the Brahmas need to do to try and save their season. The fact is that Dormady has played now 3 weeks, and he's gotten worse and worse. Now, he has that upside. We've talked about it. He is a quarterback that has high upside. But just like with E.J. Perry, we're seeing, which I'm going to get to with the Panthers. Danny Etling has less of an upside from what we're seeing. But when he's more consistent, which is what Garbers was before that hand injury, Garbers was a more consistent quarterback. That's why I came around to him realizing he's a solid quarterback. He's consistent. He might not be this, guy who's going to go for 300 yards in the air and 100 in the ground, but he's going to get the job done. Dormady so far has not gotten the job done in any game aside from one half against the Panthers. This team's defense is still incredible. This team's defense can still keep them in games. Just check what they did against DC. The defense kept them in the game. Their running game was good, and that was what I was concerned about last week, was that it was a 1-week wonder. No, we've now seen 2 weeks where the running game is going good. But now, instead of it being the rushing attack is terrible, but the passing game is good, it's the passing game is terrible, the rushing attack is good. Whereas the team above them is getting better at almost everything. This team is just swapping a problem. Now, their defense is still good. This next week's going to be a big tell on exactly what they can do. They need to rebound and get a win this next week. A loss this next week, that'd be terrifying. Let's see what happens, but for now, the Brahmas go to 4. They move 1 spot down due to the loss. Not moving them down to 5, though. If that game was at San Antonio, I think the Brahmas probably eke out a win there. But I can't say for certain, so I'm only moving them down 1 spot, but mainly also because of Dormady. Now, injuries is the tale of this team. This team has been banged up really the most. I know some people would argue that their team always is, but, come on. Look, this team lost Alex Millette early on. They lost D. Strong at kicker. They lost Garbers, and those are just the three biggest names. But you have a couple other guys as well. Greg Eland, another offensive lineman. Derek Kelly, another offensive lineman. Quincy Wilson, a cornerback. Nate Weiland, a linebacker. But when you look at that offensive injury list, 3 different offensive linemen have been put on IR, and your starting quarterback was put on IR. And even this past week, even though, some of these guys did end up playing and some didn't, you still have Wyatt Ray dealing with injuries. You still have Tim Ward dealing with injuries. You still have Anthony McFarland dealing with injuries. You have Delonte Scott dealing with injuries. Brad Wing, he had a great game, but even he is dealing with injuries. You have a lot of these guys on your team that are dealing with injuries as well. You do not want to be banged up at this point in the season. Getting hurt now could cost you a playoff spot. And it sucks to see it happen to the Brahmas, but at this point, there's a lot of concern about injuries. Their injuries have been huge and impactful. These aren't just, these are depth pieces. No, when you're seeing guys like Tim Ward and Wyatt Ray on your injury report, when you're seeing 3 different offensive linemen on your IR and your starting quarterback, you start to see why this past week didn't go so well for them and why there's genuine concern in San Antonio. Hopefully they're able to rebound this next week, but in terms of impactful injuries, this team is probably the worst in that regard. Now, number 3 is going to be the Michigan Panthers. Moving up to 3, despite the fact that it was a very tight game against Arlington, because again, everybody gets played tough by Arlington, right? I mean, even St. Louis barely eked out a win against Arlington, basically the same way. So if you're saying that they don't deserve to move up because they beat Arlington, then you're basically discrediting one of St. Louis's wins as well. Look, Danny Etling's a solid QB. He is an upgrade over E.J. Perry. I think I've seen enough. I've seen a couple games now where he is playing a much more consistent offense. Their ground game. Even though statistically wise, it was a down week, Wes Hills did not play all that great. Colburn didn't play all that great. They had a couple of clutch runs. And even Etling showed some ground game, which we didn't know exactly how good it was going to be. He had that 140-yard dash that was huge. And again, through the air, he got the job done. Another Marcus Sims bomb this week. And of course, how can we forget about Jake Bates? Now, if you're wondering why it only says 5 for 5, but I'm seeing, more than 5 kicks, that's because on multiple occasions, he made a kick that was ruled good on the field, but due to a penalty that the Panthers accepted, the Panthers were able to continue their drive, which ironically both ended in field goals anyway for Bates. But yes, Bates rebounded incredibly. This past week was insane. This was reminiscent of that Luis Aguilar game we saw last year. Because, when you talk about statistically, he was 5 for 5, including another 60-yard field goal, and he had the game-winning 42-yarder. Come on. Bates has been incredible. Now, the thing is that with this team is everything is more of a feel with this one. This is the eye test type of team, right? Statistically, they're not necessarily dominant. But when you're watching them, you're seeing Etling be a much more consistent thrower of the football over what E.J. Perry was. Yes, you're seeing the ground game while still not playing great statistically. They did have a couple of good moments. Now, we do need to see this ground game go back to being solid like it was the previous week, which is the big tell for this team. This team still has that slight weakness in the ground game where it's still very much an inconsistent unit. So hopefully it rebounds, but I'm moving up to 3. They were able to eke out a win that really shows just what kind of team you are. A bad team folds in that situation. The Panthers didn't. They were able to get another last-second drive to get a field goal. The fact is, people try to discredit the win against the Battlehawks. If your team is able to drive down the field with less than a minute left or less than 30 seconds left to get into field goal range, they're doing the job that they need to do. If they win on a last-second field goal, they deserve the win. And that's what the Panthers have done again. They were able to get in field goal range, get the field goal up, and score. They're the 3rd best team in the league. Clearly not a top 2 team, but the 3rd best team in the league, yes. I think at this point it's safe to say that Etling is a better QB than Quentin Dormady. And that's really the reason they're above him, right? When they played the first time, it was E.J. Perry versus Quentin Dormady in Dormady's first start. And then looking at it now, 3 weeks later, the past 2 weeks, Etling has played anywhere from good to exceptional, whereas Dormady has played anywhere from mediocre to bad. So I think if they were to rematch today, the Panthers win. That's why I have the Panthers above them at 3, despite them losing to them 3 weeks ago, because these two teams are very different from them. Panthers at 3. Now, their most impactful injuries are ones that are big concerns for this upcoming week. Frank Gidna was out for the game after a shoulder injury, hoping it's not a big deal. We'll find out later this week. If it is like a season-ending injury or a couple-week injury, Panthers are probably going to move down in the power rankings because they probably lose this week. Hopefully it's nothing big. There were a few inactives that were mainly due to injuries, whether it be some of their offensive linemen or some of their receivers. And then, of course, on the IR, you have guys like E.J. Perry, who's on IR, Devin Ross, who's on IR, and a couple other ones. Now, where E.J. Perry's injury isn't as big a deal as Garber's, you now have that concern of your backup quarterback, which is a legit concern for the Panthers. But the biggest one was the Frank Gidna injury. Hopefully everything is fine with him. Hopefully it was just a game injury. We'll find out. But the Panthers' impactful injuries, they have a few, but it's not the worst in the league. They come in at 3. Now, coming in at number 2 is going to be the St. Louis Battlehawks. Again, the St. Louis Battlehawks are number 2 again. I mean, who would you expect in the top 2? The Battlehawks won, but this was not an impressive win. They won. It was a solid win, but the issues that I expected to see did happen. Now, yes, they only got sacked twice, but the Roughnecks defense played a lot better than a lot of other people suggested. I called it during the game picks, and it ended up being the intentional safety that really changed it from being, covering the spread. The Roughnecks defense was going to do enough to slow down the Battlehawks offense. The Battlehawks offense was not going to continue to put up 30-plus points every game. And look at their rushing game. Their rushing game was abysmal. Now, again, one of that was the intentional safety. That's why they had negative 5 yards overall. But across their 3 main running backs, Gallman only had 3 carries. Jacob Saylors had 8 carries for 18 yards. And McCarron's 4 carries were for 4 yards. So their overall ground game was pretty bad. Now, the one thing is ever since Mike Rose has gotten back, and even though he's had some other injuries, the defense has been incredible. The defense is right behind the Stallions. Points allowed, they're at 93. Yards per game, they're at 222. They're among the league's elite defense with them and the Stallions. Ever since they got him back, the defense has been so much better. Their turnover differential, right behind the Stallions at +3. So the Battlehawks are getting right up there in overall stats. Now, the big question is this next week. This next week has the Battlehawks versus Stallions game. This is the game that a lot of people have been waiting to see. The return of AJ to Birmingham, or Alabama, I should say. And, of course, the battle of the 2 best teams in the league. Whoever wins this game is going to be the number 1 team, probably for the rest of the regular season until the playoffs. But we'll see. The Battlehawks deserve this number 2 spot again. Even though they didn't dominate over the Roughnecks and they were able to be held in check offensively for most of the game, they still did enough. They were able to get the job done. They got the win. They deserve to be the 2 spot still. Clearly the second best team in the league. Maybe they'll be the best in the league. We'll see next week. Now, in terms of injuries, this team has had a few injuries. Now, in terms of the IR, Mateo Durant was the big one. One of their insanely good breakout players earlier in the season being put on it really hurt them. There's a couple other guys, Ben DeLuca, Callahan O'Reilly, Sage Dockstader, Johnny Buchanan. All of those hurt as well. But then you look at their overall injury list heading into this game. Steven Gonzalez was questionable with a knee injury. A couple other of your offensive linemen, we talked about it before the season, before the game, their offensive line was banged up. We saw a couple guys in Bouchard Betty, as well as Alexander, both having injuries to their foot/leg or calf. Then, of course, you had a couple other injuries. Tim Harris was out. Austin Fayalu missed another game due to an injury. Darius Shepard was able to go this game after, missing last week. Overall, this team has a few injuries. It's, again, not horrid, though the Mateo Durant one still really hurts. You'd love to have him back now. But is what it is. Battlehawks at 2. Number 1, the Birmingham Stallions. Again. I mean, is there even an argument? I said they were going to go out there and make a statement against the Showboats, and that's exactly what they did. Over twice as many yards as the Showboats. Almost twice as many rushing yards. Well over twice as many passing yards. Beat them in the turnover battle 3-0. Got 3 more sacks. Held the Showboats to missing the first 4th and 12 of the season. I mean, come on. Look, the Stallions at this point are leading the entire league in turnover differential, yards per game, rushing yards per game, which is by a wide margin, passing yards per game, and yards per game is by a wide margin, kicking points, and points allowed. And even points allowed is by a pretty decent margin compared to the Battlehawks. I mean, look, Adrian Martinez, there's people legitimately talking about him being the best QB in the league. He hasn't played a full season. Remember, he didn't play a couple games. He only played a couple drives in certain games. Despite not playing the full 6-game season to this point, He's still right behind the rushing title in the UFL and is up there for passing stats. Another dominant game. 4 touchdowns, first time this season. 368 yards passing on 23 completions. He averaged over 10 yards in attempt. 64 completion percentage. That's crazy. I mean, their ground game, he didn't even do a ton on the ground either. He had a couple runs late, but he really didn't have to do much. And even though Person didn't have the same game he's had before, CJ Marable went back to form, having that 115-yard rush, and overall still being an insanely good running back this past week. When you have a legit 1-2 punch at the running back position and a quarterback that can run but doesn't have to, come on. They're the best team in the league at this point. Now we'll see if they can keep that title this next week, but they're definitely number one. Injuries. This is bad. Now, the first one is the Lorenzo Burns injury. He had to be put in the ambulance, but from everything that we've heard, he seems to be doing okay, doing fine afterwards. Very scary sight, but he wasn't even the only injury. Other guys like DeMarcus Gates took shots, and we don't know exactly how bad they are. We'll see, in the coming days. But this team's had a lot of injuries during that game and even during the season. He's not mentioned here, but Colby Wadman got released because he got hurt. So that was their starting punter out. Their starting kicker is on IR. Scooby Wright is probably retiring, but he was put on IR, which is why he's probably retiring from what he said. Deontay Brown, Chris Jackson put on it. And then while their injury report was pretty small, it still had JoJo Tillery, a great safety that was out for the game. Kenny Robinson was probable. So this team heading into this past week wasn't horrid. It was bad, but it wasn't horrid. But now with Lorenzo Burns being, a bunch of question marks, DeMarcus Gates being question marks, it's just ain't looking too good, but we'll see. Stallions at number 1. So that'll do it. This has been Zomfox. Let me know down below if you agree with my power rankings or what you would change, as well as any suggestions for what you want my, second part to be. This most impactful injuries was a suggestion, which I ended up doing. So if you have any suggestion for it, leave it down below. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new here. I do at least 4 UFL videos a week, as well as 1 weekly short. And as always, if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, think about becoming a channel member for 99 cents a month as the lowest tier. You'll get an exclusive video every month, as well as team emojis and a few other benefits as well. And as always, have a great night.